Good morning, students. Today we will discuss about the second chapter. So this chapter mainly concerned with the classification of the living world, that is called as biological classification. So the second chapter is biological classification. So since the dawn of civilization, so the scientists, they have been attempted many times to classify the whole living world. But whatever the earliest classification that was done by the different scientists, that was done instantly. They not followed any criteria of the scientific method. They not classify the living organisms based on any scientific criteria. Only they classified the whole living world instinctively, that too based on its utilization, that is the need of the organism for the mankind. So that too which is based on the food, that means that organism is used for food, or it may be for shelter, or it may be used for clothing. That means it is purely based on the primary needs of the man. It is not based on any scientific criteria. So later on, one of the pioneer of biology, he was none other than Aristotle. Aristotle was made the first attempt to classify this living organism. That too, it is purely based on the scientific criteria. So, based on which scientific criteria he classified the living organism, that too based on morphology. Based on morphology of the organisms. What is the meaning of morphology? Morphology, which mainly deals with the study of external features of the organism, external character, what is visible for the outside world, that is called as morphology, which is purely based on external characters of an organism, that is called as morphology. Based on this criteria, he classified the living organisms into plants and animals. Again, here he classified the plants based on its external characters. So those plants which are very sappy, that means soft and small, that are called as herbs, and those which having the stout, cylindrical and bushy nature of the plant, that are called as shrubs, and those which can grow to 6 to more than that 6 feet in its length that are called as trees, and those plants which having very soft stem that can climb on the supports called as climbers, twiners, lianas, etc. In that way, we classify the plants also into herb, shrubs, trees, climbers, twiners, etc. And he classified the animals into two groups, that is called as Anaima and Anaima. Anaima and Anaima. What is Anaima? Anaima means animals without red blood. That is the animals without RBC. Animals without red blood. That is without RBC or called as Anaima. Anaima means we can see. For example, you take cockroach. This is usually called as what? Anaimate. That is the animal having colorless blood. That is what called as Anaima. And what is Anaima? A means what? Anaima means the animals which having RBC. Animals with red blood. That is those which having RBC are called as Inanimates or Anaima. And also he classified the animals into Andayuja and Jarayuja. Yuja and Jarayuja. Andayujans are nothing but oviparous. Jarayujans are nothing but viviparous. That means the first attempt of classifying the animals, this was mainly made by Aristotle. That too he classified the animals into Inanimates or Anaima as well as Anaima, and also based on the age, production of a progeny, that he classified that into Andayujans and Jarayujans, that is oviparous and viviparous. Because of this, we can always regard Aristotle is regarded as father of biology as well as father of zoology. Who is regarded as the father of biology and zoology? Aristotle. So he classified the whole living organisms into only two groups. That too, he followed one scientific criteria which is purely based on external characters of an organism, that is based on morphology. Now, after Aristotle attempt, so the next scientist who is also one of the pioneer of biology, who is called as Linnaeus. So Linnaeus made again two kingdom system of classification. The Linnaeus who classified the whole living world, that is the living organisms, into again two kingdoms. One is called as Plantae and second is called as Animalia. Now here he classified the living world or living organisms that too purely based on a scientific criteria called as what? Again, morphologies. Based on only external features, he classified the whole living world or organisms into two kingdoms. One is called as Plantae and Animalia. Now here, this two kingdom system of classification which was made by Linnaeus, that too one is kingdom Plantae, another one is Animalia. But some organisms which not falls either of these two categories. There are some organisms which not included, which not falls either of these Plantae or Animalia, where we can keep that kind of organism. That means beside the morphology, beside the gross morphology, some other scientific criteria are needed to classify the living organisms. That too, here some organisms are, or we can say, by this two kingdom system of classification, we cannot differentiate unicellular and multicellular organism, and they cannot differentiate which is prokaryotic organisms and which is eukaryotic. We cannot differentiate which organism is a prokaryote and which is eukaryote. I will explain about this prokaryote and eukaryote. And also, by this two kingdom classification, we cannot differentiate which are photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic. So, all these issues are due to this two kingdom classification. Now the need is created. So whatever the two kingdom system of classification that was given by Linnaeus, it is inadequate. We cannot classify the organisms according to this. So we cannot keep this unicellular, multicellular in the same kingdoms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic. So here, beside this morphology, some other scientific criteria are needed to classify this living world or to classify the living organism. So beside what? Beside this gross morphology and some other characters we should consider to classify the living organisms, which are those criteria in addition to the morphology are considered, and that created a need to give the next type of kingdom. So that criteria is based on cell structure and also based on cell wall nature, based on mode of nutrition, based on its habitat, and based on reproduction, and also based on its evolutionary relationship. So the earlier system of classification which was done only purely based on what? Based on this gross morphology. By looking at the external characters of an organism, they classify the whole living world. But that two kingdom system of classification is inadequate. So there are the organisms or more organisms which are not fall either of the kingdom Plantae or Animalia. So here they consider some additional characters as the criteria beside this gross morphology. That what characters are considered as the criteria are based on the cell structure, based on the nature of a cell wall, based on mode of nutrition, and based on the habitat, and based on reproduction of the organism, and major criteria based on their phylogenetic relationship, that is called as evolutionary relationship. By that, the need is created to propose the few more kingdoms. Now, this is the reason why always classification of organisms goes on changing over a time, because here we cannot consider only a single criteria to classify. If we consider that kind of classification, so that becomes inadequate. It is not sufficient, because some organisms that not fall under these two kingdoms. Now, after the Linnaeus, Copeland. Copeland was one of the famous scientists who proposed three kingdom system of classification. So by this again, what happens? Those organisms which not falls either of the three kingdoms. Again the need is created. That gives rise to how many kingdoms? 4 kingdom system that was given by Haeckel. Haeckel. Now that also not sufficient, because some organisms that not fall under any of the 4 kingdom system of classification. That means always the classification system goes on changing. Finally, in 1969, R.H. Whittaker, who proposed 5 kingdom system of classification. 1 kingdom system of classification. This is very important 1 mark question, not only in your board and also for CET or NEET, any MCQ. Generally we frame this question. Who proposed the 5 kingdom system of classification? That is R.H. Whittaker, who proposed the 5 kingdom system of classification. Now, this 5 kingdom system of classification is the most accepted modern system of classification, and this is purely based on the cell structure. Second is based on thallus organization, and based on mode of nutrition, and based on So here R.H. Whittaker, who proposed the most accepted system of classification, according to the each and every organism has got a division or it has got a place in the particular kingdom based on its few biological characters, that is based on its cell structure, based on thallus organization, based on mode of nutrition, as well as based on phylogenetic relation, that means evolutionary relationships. Phylogenetic is nothing but based on evolutionary relationships. Now, the earliest classification that was made by Linnaeus, that is two kingdom system of classification. So in that system, or not only in that system, it may be 3 kingdom, it may be 4 kingdom, 5 kingdom. These 2 kingdoms, plants as well as animals, that are remain constant. Because purely based on easily observable morphological features, they classified the living world or the living organisms into plants and animals. Now by this instinctively or by following the unscientific way of classification, that is earlier system of classification that not differentiated unicellular organisms, this not differentiated, which one? Unicellular and multicellular organisms, not differentiated prokaryotes and eukaryotic organisms, and not differentiated photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic organisms. Now, mainly, so this earlier system of classification that was made by the Linnaeus, so here what happens? Mainly based on one of the biological criteria, that is what? Morphological feature. Here he placed bacteria, starting from bacteria, blue, green, algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, that are nothing but ferns, shade-loving plants, and bryophytes that include mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Okay, blue-green algae, bacteria, and also fungi, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, as well as the angiosperm. All that comes under the same kingdom called as plant. They included all these organisms starting from very simple primitive forms of life that are bacteria up to the highly advanced and evolved plants called as angiosperm. They included all these under the same kingdom called as plantae, that too based on one unified character, that is based on the presence of a cell wall. Based on a unified character, that is only by the presence of cell wall. Those organisms which having cell wall, that all comes under the kingdom plantae. As we know, the bacterial cell wall is different, that is peptidoglycan, even in blue-green algae, but in bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperm, angiosperm, there is a cellulosic cell wall, but in case of fungi, there is a different type of cell wall. It is not at all similar to the cellulose that is commonly called as chitin. It is also a polysaccharide, but it is not similar to the cell wall. So, even though these groups of plants, they differ in its character, they vary in its features, but only having one unified character that is called as cell wall. All these grouped under the same kingdom called as plantae. So this is the way of classification that was made by earlier scientists in the early system of classifications that were unscientific. Now, so here they cannot differentiate unicellular, multicellular, prokaryotes, eukaryotes. So what is the difference between the prokaryotes and eukaryotes? As we know, prokaryotes are very simple, primitive type of organisms, which having a nucleus, but that nucleus is not bounded by its own nuclear membrane. There is no nuclear membrane, and the genetic material is naked. It is not bounded by any jacket. That are called as prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are those which completely lack what? The lack of nuclear membrane. There is no nuclear membrane. Nuclear sheath is absent. That are called as prokaryotes. What are eukaryotes? Eukaryotes are those which having a distinct or a definite nuclear membrane, that is the true nucleus. That means those which having a definite